Ice formed a brittle lace on the inside of the glass, blurring the world into a smear of yellow light and shifting shadow. Lynn pressed closer, the cold of the pain a dead thing against her cheek. Hunger was a hollow ache below her ribs, a quiet beast that had been gnawing for 2 days. Outside, the town of Absolution was a study in gray and white. The snow on the muddy street churned into a frozen slurry. But inside the saloon, it was Christmas Eve. Men with flushed faces drank from thick glasses, their laughter a dull roar that could not penetrate the window. At a small table, set away from the others, a man ate alone. He was immense, a creature of the high places, with a beard the color of winter frost and dark hair that fell past his shoulders. A slab of steak, dark and glistening, sat on his plate, beside a mound of steaming potatoes. He ate with a slow, deliberate purpose, as if the food were a task to be completed. Lynn's world had shrunk to that plate. The memory of warmth, of sustenance, was a phantom limb she could almost feel. She had walked from the railhead, her husband's grave a fresh mound of earth she could no longer afford to visit, with nothing but the clothes she wore, a thin prairie dress the color of dust, and a gray scarf knitted by hands long still. The man looked up. His eyes, clear and gray as a winter sky, met hers through the distorted glass. There was no pity in them, no surprise, only a flat, silent acknowledgment. He saw her. He saw the hunger that was her whole existence in that moment. She did not look away. Shame was a luxury, and she had spent the last of it miles back. She simply watched him, this mountain of a man, and he watched her, a ghost at the feast. A man in a waistcoat, his face slick with sweat, approached the big man's table. Lynn could not hear the words, but she saw the dismissive gesture, the curl of the man's lip as he glanced toward the window, toward her. The mountain man gunner did not turn. He simply laid his fork down beside his knife, the silver making a quiet click against the stoneware. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping a protest against the floorboards, and rose. He was even larger standing, a figure built to withstand storms and solitude. He picked up his plate, the half-eaten meal a treasure beyond imagining, and walked toward the door. The other men in the saloon fell quiet, their drunken cheer silenced by his passage. The door swung open, spilling a wave of heat and noise and the smell of roasted meat into the frozen air. Lynn flinched back but stood her ground. Gunner stepped out onto the boardwalk, his boots making no sound in the fresh dusting of snow. He stopped in front of her, the cold air plumed from his mouth. He held out the plate. "You look hungrier than I am," he said. His voice was low, a rumble like stones shifting deep underground. She stared at the food, then at his face. It was a face carved by solitude, the lines around his eyes etched by 1,000 suns and 1,000 snows. This was not charity. It was a statement of fact. She took the plate. Her fingers, numb with cold, trembled as they brushed his. The plate was warm. She did not thank him. The word would have been too small. Instead, she took the fork and lifted a piece of potato to her mouth. It was soft and hot and real. He watched her eat, his expression unreadable, his massive frame a bulwark against the biting air that swept down Main Street. This was his test, not of her gratitude, but of her pride. She ate slowly, deliberately, meeting his gaze with each mouthful. She would not be a beggar, cowering over a gift. She was a woman accepting what was offered, a soul answering its own stark need without apology. When she was finished, she held the empty plate out to him. He took it, his gaze sweeping over her worn dress, the thin scarf, the exhaustion that was bone deep in her face. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "The town has no place for you," he stated. It was not a question. No, she agreed, her own voice thin but steady. He considered her for a long moment, the silence stretching between them, thick with the falling snow. The lights of the saloon seemed distant now, a world to which neither of them belonged. My cabin is a day's walk. There is food and work. It was not an invitation to comfort. It was an offer of survival, as stark and unadorned as the landscape around them. He did not wait for her answer. He turned and started walking, his long strides eating up the snow-covered street, heading toward the dark maw of the mountains that loomed over the town. She had a choice: to remain here and perish in the cold indifference of absolution, or to follow this stranger into an even greater wilderness. She looked once more at the saloon, at the faces in the window that were already turning away, forgetting her. Then she tightened the gray scarf around her neck and followed the tracks he left in the snow, a silent shadow moving away from the light. The town fell away behind them, its meager light swallowed by the immense darkness and the swirling snow. The path Gunner took was not a path at all, but an instinctual line he drew through the timber and rock. He moved with a heavy, ground-covering rhythm that she struggled to match. The cold deepened, sinking its teeth into her marrow. Every breath was a shard of glass in her lungs. He never looked back to see if she was following. He knew she was. He could hear the soft crunch of her worn boots, the whisper of her thin dress against the brush. It was a sound of desperation, and he was fluent in its language. He was testing her. She understood this with a clarity that transcended the fog of her exhaustion. He was testing her endurance, her will. He offered no hand on the steep inclines, no word of encouragement when she stumbled. He simply was, a silent force moving ahead, and she had to choose with every step to keep him in her sight. The moon was a splinter of bone behind the clouds, casting a weak, ghostly light that made the snowfields gleam and the pines stand like legions of black-robed sentinels. They walked in a shared silence that was more profound than any conversation. The world was reduced to the sound of their breathing, the squeak of snow underfoot, and the distant, mournful cry of a hunting owl. Lynn focused on the back of his deerskin coat, on the steady swing of his arms. She thought of her husband, a scholar whose hands had been soft with ink, not calluses. He had spoken of coming west as a grand adventure, a poem waiting to be written. He had not been prepared for its brutal prose. He had lasted one winter. She would last this one. She would not think of the past. The past was a grave in frozen ground. She would not think of the future. The future was a terrifying blank. There was only the next step, and the one after that. Placing one foot in front of the other was her only prayer, her only creed. Hours bled into one another. The landscape became a repetitive dream of white slopes and black trees. Just when she felt her legs would fold, that she would simply lie down in the snow and let the final cold take her, he stopped. Ahead, nestled in a thick stand of firs that offered some protection from the elements, was a cabin. It was small, brutally simple, its logs chinked with mud and moss, its roof sagging under a heavy blanket of snow. A thread of smoke, thin and gray, rose from a stone chimney, a fragile signal of life in the vast sleeping wilderness. He pushed the rough plank door open without a word and stepped inside. He did not hold it for her. He expected her to follow under her own power. She gathered the last of her strength and crossed the threshold, moving from the piercing cold into a space that was only marginally warmer. The interior was as stark as the outside. A single room, a stone hearth where a low fire glowed, a crude table with one chair, and a bed built into the wall piled with furs. It was the den of a solitary animal, a place stripped of all but the essentials for survival. The air smelled of wood smoke, pine, and curing leather. He gestured toward the fire. "Warm yourself." She knelt on the hearth, holding her hands out to the weak flames. The feeling returning to her fingers was a wave of pure agony. She did not make a sound. She accepted the pain as part of the bargain. He moved about the small space, his size making it seem even smaller. He added a log to the fire, the wood hissing as it caught. He filled a tin pot with snow from a bucket by the door and set it on a hook over the flames. He was not a man of wasted movements. Every action was precise, efficient, born of a long and intimate acquaintance with hardship. His poverty seemed absolute. The floor was packed earth. The single window was covered with a stretched, oiled hide that let in a pale, featureless light. There were no books, no pictures, nothing to speak of the man who lived here beyond his ability to endure. Yet there was a strange, clean order to the place. The few tools hanging on the wall were sharp and well oiled. The furs on the bed were clean. It was the poverty of choice, not of neglect. He broke a piece of dried meat from a strip hanging from the rafters and handed it to her, along with a tin cup of hot water. The jerky was tough and salty, but it was sustenance. It was life. She chewed it slowly, feeling the strength seep back into her limbs. He sat in the single chair, watching her, his gray eyes missing nothing. She was a puzzle dropped on his doorstep, and he was studying the pieces. "You have a name," he said. It was not a question. "Lynn," she answered, her voice raspy. "Gunner," he replied. And that was all. No questions about where she came from or where she was going. The storm had brought her here. That was explanation enough for the mountains. He pointed to the pile of furs on the cot. "Sleep." He himself took a thick bear hide from a peg, wrapped it around his shoulders, and settled into the chair by the fire, his back to her. He would stand watch. She was too exhausted to feel fear or even gratitude. She crawled into the nest of furs. They smelled of him, a wild, clean scent of pine and cold air. It was not comforting, but it was real. As she drifted into a sleep that was closer to oblivion, she realized she had not spoken her husband's name in months. It felt like a betrayal, and also, terrifyingly, like a release. The next day began before dawn, in the blue-gray twilight that precedes the sun. Gunner was already awake, or perhaps he had never slept. The fire was built up, and the smell of boiling grain filled the small cabin. He gave her a bowl of the hot, tasteless mush without a word, and she ate it. Then the work began. He handed her a small, wickedly sharp axe. "The woodpile needs to grow," he said, and led her outside into the blinding white of the new day. The air was so cold it felt solid. He showed her how to split the smaller logs, not with brute force, which she did not possess, but with timing and precision, letting the weight of the axe head do the work. He demonstrated once, a single, fluid motion that sent 2 perfect halves of a log flying apart. Then he stepped back and watched. Her first attempts were clumsy. The axe bounced off the wood, jarring her arms to the shoulder. She did not complain. She did not look to him for help. She simply repositioned the log, took a breath, and tried again. And again. He observed her from the doorway of the cabin, mending a leather strap with a needle and thick thread. He saw the frustration in the set of her jaw, but also the fierce, quiet determination. She was not built for this life, for this labor. Her hands were small, her frame delicate under the worn dress. But there was a core of iron in her that he recognized. It was the same iron that resided in him. It was the will to continue when all reason dictated surrender. By midday she had established a rhythm. A small, respectable pile of split wood lay beside her. Her muscles screamed in protest, and her hands were raw, but she did not stop. He came out and took the axe from her. Enough. He handed her a bucket. Water, from the creek. Do not break the ice close to the bank. It is thin. The creek was a short walk through the silent, snow-laden trees. It was a black ribbon of moving water in a white world, gurgling softly under shelves of ice. She found a spot where the current ran faster, where the ice was a thin, clear sheet. She broke it with a rock and dipped the bucket, the shock of the frigid water on her skin making her gasp. The journey back, hauling the heavy, sloshing bucket, was another trial, but when she returned, she saw he had laid out 2 skinned rabbits on the table. He had been hunting while she worked. They worked side by side in the small space, the silence broken only by the sound of his knife and the crackle of the fire. He showed her how to prepare the meat, how to stretch the pelts for curing. He was a patient teacher, his large hands surprisingly deft. There was no wasted speech between them. A word, a gesture, was all that was needed. She learned to read the tightening of his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes. He learned to read the weariness in her posture, the resolve in the way she held her head. A language was forming between them, a language of shared tasks and mutual observation. That afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks, casting long blue shadows across the snow, the sound of hoofbeats broke the profound silence. Lynn looked up, startled. Gunner's head had already lifted, his body instantly alert. He moved to the door and peered out. A man on a fine black horse was riding up the narrow track to the cabin. He was dressed in a thick wool coat with a fur collar, his face clean-shaven and prosperous. It was the man from the saloon, the one who had spoken to Gunner. Gunner stepped outside, placing himself between the cabin and the approaching rider. Lynn watched from the doorway, a sudden knot of ice forming in her stomach. The man, Flint, reined in his horse, looking down at Gunner with an air of casual ownership. He surveyed the poor cabin, the small wood pile, and his lip curled in a sneer. "Still living like a savage, Gunner?" Flint said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. Gunner did not reply. He stood like a stone, waiting. Flint's gaze slid past him, fixing on Lynn in the doorway. His eyes lingered on her, a greedy, assessing look that made her skin crawl. "I saw you take in some stray charity," Flint said. "This is no place for a woman. The town has accommodations. I own the hotel. She'd be warm, well fed." The offer hung in the air, thick and ugly. It was not about warmth or food. It was about possession. Gunner's voice, when he finally spoke, was dangerously low. "She is not your concern." Flint laughed, a short, barking sound. "Everything in these hills is my concern. I have the claims, the deeds. This land you're squatting on, it's mine. I've let you stay out of nostalgia. But bringing this kind of trouble here changes things." "There is no trouble here," Gunner said. "Only you." Flint's smile vanished. "You have nothing, mountain man. A broken down shack, a few furs. I could have the sheriff run you out before the next snow. Think about it." He looked at Lynn again. "And you? Think about my offer. A warm bed is better than a frozen grave." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving a trail of churned snow and echoing threats behind him. Gunner stood for a long time, staring after him, his fists clenched at his sides. He was a force of nature, a storm gathering on a silent peak. Lynn realized she was not afraid of the wilderness. She was afraid of the men who sought to own it. The visit from Flint left a poison in the air. The vast silence of the mountains no longer felt like peace. It felt like isolation. The cabin, which had been a refuge, now seemed like a trap. Gunner became even more withdrawn, his quietness deepening into a brooding stillness. He spent hours staring into the fire, his jaw tight, his thoughts a locked room she could not enter. Lynn continued her work, her hands now calloused and her muscles aching with a familiar fire. She chopped wood, hauled water, mended his worn buckskins with small, neat stitches. The work was an anchor in a sea of uncertainty. It was real. The threat from Flint was real too. She had seen men like him before, men who saw the world as a collection of things to be acquired. They mistook poverty for weakness and solitude for helplessness. They were always wrong, but they caused immense damage in the process of discovering their error. One evening the wind began to rise. It started as a low moan through the pines, a mournful sound that grew steadily into a high, shrieking howl. Snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in a thick, blinding curtain that erased the world outside the cabin door. The blizzard hit them with the force of a physical blow. The small cabin shuddered under the assault. Wind screamed through the tiny gaps in the chinking, and fine, powdery snow sifted in under the door. Gunner worked to secure their small fortress, packing more mud into the cracks, reinforcing the hide over the window. He moved with an urgency she had not seen before. This was a different kind of enemy, one he could not face down with his fists. It was an impersonal, elemental fury. They were trapped. The world shrank to the four walls of the cabin, to the circle of light cast by the fire. The storm raged for a day, and then another. Time lost its meaning, measured only by the logs Gunner added to the fire and the meager meals they shared. The silence between them changed again. It was no longer a silence of observation, but one of shared vulnerability. They were two small heartbeats in the heart of a great white storm. On the second night of the blizzard, the cold became relentless. Despite the roaring fire, a deep chill permeated the cabin. Lynn found herself shivering uncontrollably, a deep, racking tremor that came from the bone. She tried to hide it, pulling the thin scarf tighter around her shoulders, but Gunner noticed. He stopped his pacing and looked at her, his gray eyes narrowed with concern. He walked to the bed, pulled off the thickest fur, a heavy, magnificent wolf pelt, its fur deep and silver-tipped, and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was heavy and surprisingly warm, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the faint, wild smell of the animal. "Thank you," she whispered. He merely grunted in response, but he did not move away. He stood by her chair, a silent guardian, his presence a comfort she would not have expected. His gaze fell upon her hands, which were clenched in her lap. He reached out, his large, calloused hand engulfing one of hers. He gently uncurled her fingers. Her palms were a mess of blisters, some broken and raw from the axe. He said nothing. He went to a small wooden chest in the corner, one she had assumed held tools, and took out a small tin. He opened it, revealing a dark, pungent salve. He knelt before her, and with a touch that was surprisingly gentle, began to treat her wounds. His thumb moved slowly over her palm, working the salve into the broken skin. The gesture was so intimate, so devoid of artifice, it stole her breath. She watched the top of his head, the way his dark hair fell forward, hiding his face. In that moment, he was not a fearsome mountain man. He was just a man, tending to a wound. She did not pull away. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt the touch of another person not as a threat or a transaction, but as a simple, unadorned act of care. The storm howled outside, a beast trying to claw its way in, but inside the tiny cabin, a fragile peace had settled. He finished his work and stood up, his face once again an unreadable mask. "The storm will break by morning," he said. He went back to his chair by the fire, wrapping the bearskin around his shoulders, but the space between them had changed. It was no longer a gulf of strangeness and suspicion. A bridge had been built, silently, in the heart of the storm. It was a bridge made of shared work, shared danger, and a small tin of healing salve. The world was born anew in silence and blinding light. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a landscape sculpted into impossible, beautiful shapes. The snow was piled in deep drifts against the cabin, and every branch of every tree was coated in a thick layer of white. It was a world scrubbed clean, pristine, and unforgiving. Gunner pushed the door open against a wall of snow, digging them out with a crude shovel. The air that rushed in was frigid but clean, smelling of pine and cold stone. It felt like the first breath after a long illness. "We have to move," he said, his voice flat. Lynn stared at him, confused. Back to the town? The thought of returning to absolution, to the predatory gaze of Flint, was a cold dread in her gut. "No," he said. He gestured with his head, not toward the path they had taken, but deeper into the mountains, toward the high, jagged peaks that scraped the sky. There. She did not understand. There was nothing up there but rock and ice and more wilderness. To go deeper in seemed like madness. But she looked at his face, at the grim certainty in his eyes, and she trusted him. She had no reason to, not really. He was a stranger who had offered her shelter that was little better than the elements themselves. But he had also shared his food, wrapped her in his warmest fur, and tended to her hands. Trust was not a matter of reason. It was a quiet instinct, a recognition of strength, and a surprising, hidden well of decency. She simply nodded. "I will be ready." They packed little. He took his rifle, a knife, and a small pack with some dried meat and a water skin. She had nothing to pack but the clothes on her back and the wolf pelt he had given her, which she now wore as a cloak. He had fashioned crude snowshoes for them both from bent branches and leather thongs, and he showed her how to walk in them, a wide, gliding gait that kept them atop the deep snow. The journey was arduous. They climbed steadily, moving out of the thick timberline onto the exposed shoulders of the mountain. The sun on the snow was dazzling, and the world was a vast, silent expanse of white and blue. Below them, the forest stretched out like a dark green sea. The little cabin was soon lost to view, a tiny, insignificant speck. Lynn's lungs burned with the effort in the thin air, but she did not fall behind. The work of the past days, the splitting of wood and the hauling of water, had hardened her. She felt a strength in her own body she had not known she possessed. Gunner set a relentless pace, but it was a pace he knew she could manage. He was no longer testing her. He was leading her. There was a purpose in his stride now, a destination in his mind. As they climbed higher, the wind returned, a keen, slicing blade that whipped plumes of snow from the high ridges. They had to lean into it, their heads bowed, communicating with hand signals. It was a battle against the mountain itself. Late in the afternoon they reached a high pass, a narrow saddle of rock between two towering peaks. The wind was ferocious here, a physical force that threatened to tear them from their feet. Gunner grabbed her arm, his grip like iron, and pulled her behind the tall outcropping of rock that offered some shelter. "Almost there," he shouted over the roar of the wind. She looked at him, her face numb, her eyes watering from the cold. Where could they possibly be going? There was nothing here. Nothing but the end of the world. He pointed. Ahead of them, the pass opened onto a steep, downward slope. It was a threshold, a gateway between the world she knew and something else entirely. He led her forward, out of the shelter of the rock and to the edge of the precipice, and she saw. The wind seemed to fall away. The world went silent. Below them, nestled in a perfectly circular valley, shielded on all sides by the granite walls of the surrounding peaks, was a place that should not have existed. It was a hidden world, a secret garden in the heart of the winter. A river steaming in the cold air snaked through the valley floor, its banks a startling verdant green. Geothermal heat kept the snow at bay here, and in the center of this impossible valley, on the bank of the river, stood a lodge. It was not a cabin. It was a magnificent structure of dark, massive logs and gray river stone, with a long, low roof and tall stone chimneys from which plumes of white smoke rose into the crisp air. Sturdy outbuildings and a large corral where a small herd of hardy cattle stood contentedly were clustered nearby. It was a place of permanence, of wealth, of impossible, breathtaking beauty. It was a fortress of solitude and comfort, hidden from the world. Lynn stared, unable to process what she was seeing. It did not compute. The squalid shack, the dried meat, the worn clothes, none of it fit with this. She turned to look at Gunner. He was not looking at the valley. He was looking at her. He was watching her face, his own expression stripped bare for the first time. There was no hardness in his eyes now, only a raw, searching vulnerability. He was waiting for her reaction. This, she realized, was the final test, not of her body's endurance, but of her heart's. She did not gasp. She did not cry out in amazement. The sight of the lodge, of the impossible green valley, was so far beyond the scope of her reality that it bypassed shock and landed somewhere deeper, in a place of quiet, stunning revelation. It was like seeing the inner workings of a man's soul laid bare. All the pieces of him clicked into place. The quiet confidence, the disregard for the town and its small-minded tyrants, the reason he lived apart, the reason he had tested her. He had not been testing her for weakness, but for a particular kind of strength, the kind that was not impressed by surfaces. She turned her gaze from the valley and looked fully at him. The wind whipped strands of hair across his face, and his eyes were the color of the stone in the distant chimneys. She saw the question in them, the fear that he had guarded for so long, the fear of being seen only for what he had, not for who he was. The shack had been a filter. The hardship had been a crucible. He had wanted to know if she would break, if she would complain, if she would see him as a poor savage to be pitied or used. He had wanted to know if her spirit was as resilient as her body. She thought of Flint, with his fine horse and his sneering condescension, a man whose wealth was a weapon and a shield. And then she looked at Gunner, a man whose wealth was a secret, a burden, a fortress built to keep the world out. "You were afraid," she said, her voice soft but clear, carried on the wind. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of understanding. A muscle jumped in his jaw. His eyes searched hers, looking for the telltale glitter of greed, for the shift of calculation. He found none. He saw only a quiet comprehension that mirrored his own solitude. He had lived so long in his fortress that he had forgotten how to open the gate. "Men like Flint," he began, his voice rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself. "They see a fortune, and they see a tool. They see a man, and they see a rival. I came to these mountains with nothing. I found what was hidden. Silver. Not a lot, but enough. Enough to build a life away from all that. But the more I built, the more I had to hide." The perspective shifted, the world reconfiguring around this new truth. The narration of his life, which she had assumed was a simple story of survival, was in fact a complex tale of escape. He was not a hermit by necessity, but by choice. He was a king in self-imposed exile, guarding his small, perfect kingdom from a world he did not trust. "The shack," she said, finally understanding. "It is a watchtower." "It is a lie," he corrected her, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. To see who comes, and why. He had built a life of substance, but had been forced to live a life of shadow. He had everything a man could want, except someone to share it with. Someone who could see the man inside the fortress, not just the stone walls. They began the descent into the valley. The path was steep but well worn, a path he had walked 1,000 times. As they moved lower, the air grew warmer, the scent of pine and damp earth replacing the sterile cold of the high peaks. It was like walking from winter into a secret spring. They did not speak. The revelation lay between them, a fragile, precious thing. As they drew closer to the lodge, she saw the details. The masterful joinery of the logs, the smooth, polished stones of the walkway, the clear glass in the large windows. This was the work of the man who took pride in what he built, a man who loved permanence and beauty. And hidden among the poverty of the other cabin, she now remembered one thing that had seemed out of place. A single, finely made axe, its head perfectly balanced, its handle worn smooth with care. A tool that belonged here, not there. The telling detail. He led her to the massive front door, which was made of thick, dark wood with iron hinges. He pushed it open, and for the second time she followed him across a threshold. But this was not a hovel. This was a home. The inside was as magnificent as the outside. A great room with a vaulted ceiling, a massive stone fireplace where a fire blazed cheerfully, comfortable-looking furniture made of polished wood and soft leather. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with leather-bound volumes. It was a place of warmth, substance, and quiet intelligence. It was the truth of him. He stood in the center of the room, looking awkward and out of place in his own home, still wearing the rough clothes of his other life. He had brought her to his heart, and he did not know what to do next. She walked to the fireplace, holding her hands out to the generous warmth. She looked around the room, at the life he had built, the life he had hidden. Then she looked at him, and her expression was not one of awe at his wealth, but of a deep, quiet sorrow for his loneliness. "No one should have to live 2 lives, Gunner," she said. It was the kindest thing anyone had ever said to him. It was forgiveness and acceptance in one. He had shown her his secret, and she had not judged it or him. She had seen the cost. A great weight seemed to lift from his shoulders. The hardness that had been his armor for so long began to dissolve. He was just a man, standing in his home, with a woman who had walked through the fire of his mistrust and emerged whole. The sun, setting behind the western peaks, sent a final shaft of golden light through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It was Christmas Day. Outside, the world was a frozen wilderness, but in here, in this hidden valley, a new world was just beginning. He crossed the room to stand beside her at the fire. They stood in silence, watching the flames. It was a comfortable silence now, easy and full. "This is my home," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I built it to be shared." He turned to her, and the question was there in his eyes before he spoke the words. "Will you make it yours, Lynn?" It was not a question about sharing a house. It was a question about sharing a life, about ending their twin solitudes together. She looked up at his face, at the lines of hardship and the deep well of loneliness in his eyes, and she saw a reflection of her own journey. They were 2 survivors, 2 souls who had been tested by the wilderness and the cruelty of men. She gave him the smallest of smiles, the first true smile he had ever seen from her. It was like the sun breaking through after a long storm. "I am already home," she said.